All right, take two. I was hoping to get this recorded in one take, but when you're screwing things up whenever you talk, it's a little tricky. But anyway, welcome to Mr. K is Wrong, where I look at the Facebook posts of somebody I call Mr. K and I debunk his right wing bullcrap. In this episode, I'm looking at how Mr. K pretends to care about fraud. So I'm going to debunk something that he posted on Facebook. And the meme in this case says, if you think fraud uncovered in Minnesota is bad, wait until the fraud uncovered in California. Then wait until New York. Then wait until Illinois. Then wait until Ohio, etc. The fraud is staggering. Powerful people need to be prosecuted for fraud against Americans. So it's a very simplistic kind of meme, right? It makes it seem like all of these so-called blue states are the ones responsible for fraud, and you won't find fraud anywhere else. So the meme claims fraud will be uncovered mainly in Democratic-leaning states, and suggests corruption is concentrated there. But a serious look at actual fraud cases in the United States shows something very different. Fraud and corruption occur across the political spectrum, including among Republican politicians, conservative activists, and figures closely tied to Donald Trump and Donald Trump himself. Let's not leave him totally out of this. So, I'm doing a little bit of a deeper look at documented examples that complicate the meme's narrative. Donald Trump himself has been found liable or guilty in multiple fraud related cases. So remember, the meme calls for prosecuting powerful people for fraud. So is it, just pretending that Trump could not be one of those powerful people guilty of fraud? It's a little bit ironic because one of the most prominent examples of such a thing is Donald Trump. Remember his criminal conviction in 2024, or do we have amnesia? Remember, in 2024, Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts in New York for falsifying business records to conceal hush money payments made during the 2016 election. This marked the first time in U.S. history that at the time, former president was criminally convicted. And there's also been civil fraud ruling uh, that involved Trump's business empire. It was a separate civil case, and a New York judge ruled that Trump and his company committed financial fraud by inflating asset values to obtain favorable loans and insurance terms. The court found that Trump and associates issued more than 200 false asset valuations over about a decade. The ruling initially ordered hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties and imposed restrictions on Trump's ability to run businesses in New York. There was also the Trump Organization criminal conviction. I guess we're supposed to just forget about that. Trump's company itself has been convicted of crimes. Two Trump Organization companies were convicted of criminal tax fraud and falsifying business records in 2022. The scheme involved hiding executive compensation through perks like apartments, cars, and tuition to evade taxes. Trump personally was not charged in that particular case, but the organization bearing his name was found guilty on all 17 counts. And there were some Trump Organization executives who were convicted. Trump's longtime CFO, Alan Weisselberg, pleaded guilty to tax crimes and later perjury related to Trump's finances. He served jail time after admitting to tax evasion involving $1.7 million dollars in hidden compensation. What about the numerous Trump associates who have been convicted of financial crimes? Are we supposed to forget about those? Several people who worked closely with Trump or his campaign were convicted of fraud or similar crimes. Examples include Paul Manafort, the Trump campaign chairman, convicted of tax fraud and bank fraud. What about Michael Cohen, Trump's personal lawyer who pleaded guilty to tax evasion, bank fraud, and campaign finance violations? Now, I know he kind of turned on Trump after all that, but he was, again, very close to uh, the man himself, the orange goofball. Then there was Rick Gates, I should say, the deputy campaign chair who pleaded guilty to conspiracy and false statements. What about Roger Stone, who was convicted of obstruction and lying to Congress? Then there's George Papadopoulos. He pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. And I know his name is fun to say, and it might make you kind of giggle to say his last name, but he was somebody who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. And these are all documented federal convictions and plea agreements. You can look them up if you don't believe me. This cluster of cases is probably unusual in modern US politics and shows that corruption is not confined to one party or region. So I know it's fancy to say that, oh, all politicians are equally corrupt and blah, 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 blah. But it seems like there's a lot of corruption in Trump's orbit, more so than in certain other circles. Trump has pardoned or commuted sentences for multiple fraudsters and corrupt officials, as well in what is most obviously a pay to play scheme. It's corrupt as hell. It's very obvious that somebody behind the scenes is paying Trump at least $1 million or something like that, so he will give out pardons. It is textbook corruption. It's another key point missing from the meme. Trump has used presidential clemency to free people convicted of major fraud schemes. Like you have Philip Esformes, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Trump commuted his sentence. He had been convicted in a $1 billion Medicare fraud scheme described by prosecutors as the largest healthcare fraud case ever charged by the DOJ. Then there's Eliyahu Weinstein. I might be mispronouncing the first name on that one, but who cares? He was a fraudster. He had his sentence commuted by Trump, and he later committed another massive fraud and was sentenced again to 37 years in prison. And what about that lovable fraudster, the one who's too goofy to even hate all that much, named George Santos? Well, I suppose it'd be easier to hate him if you were ripped off by him directly. But if you're on the sidelines, he just seems like a corrupt goofball who's he's almost so comically twisted and corrupt that it's just hard to even like hate him. He's almost like a folk figure or something like that. But anyway, George Santos, sorry, I pronounced it like the word Mentos, but he's a former Republican congressman, and he pleaded guilty to fraud and identity theft for stealing campaign donations and filing false financial disclosures. And that's not really even doing justice to all the lying and the fraud schemes that he came up with. I mean, there's probably more than I could even go over in this episode successfully. It'd probably take like a long time to cover all of his stuff. You could probably start a podcast just based on his examples of fraud and the fascinating nature that uh, the fascinating nature of George Santos's, uh, I guess, crime spree. And Trump later commuted Santos's prison sentence, leading to his release after serving only a short portion of his conviction. What about Rod Blagojevich, who looks a lot like the Big Boy mascot to the Big Boy restaurant chain? Go ahead and look up a picture of Big Boy. And you can pause this episode if you want and do like a side by side of Rod Blagojevich and Big Boy. It's truly remarkable how similar he looks to that mascot. It's like it sounds like I'm exaggerating and being cruel and unfair, but goddamn, you better believe me on this. Go ahead and look that up. It's truly mind blowing how much he looks like Big Boy. Like I'm sorry to kind of derail this episode here, but man, it's a thing to see. It's a sight to behold. But anyway, Blagojevich, Trump commuted and later pardoned him. He is the former Illinois governor who was convicted of multiple corruption charges, including wire fraud and attempted extortion. Blagojevich was famously caught attempting to sell Barack Obama's vacated Senate seat. So, definitely a corrupt person, and yes, he was a Democrat. So it's proof that if you pay enough money, Trump will pardon you even across party lines. So isn't that kind of nice to know? You know, it's the one instance where he might not be a partisan hack that much if you fork over some money to him enough to get a pardon after you've committed a crime if you're a Democratic politician. Then he'll be fine with you. You know, you just gotta pay him like maybe $1 million or so. I don't know exactly what the price is, but probably something like that. You know, it's a reasonable price, only 1 million. So you can't say Trump is the most unfair person when it comes to the price of getting that get out of jail free card or what. Well, it's not free. It's $1 million. I'm just so used to saying get out of jail free, but it's not free. It's $1 million. But you know, if you've got that kind of money lying around, you know, you might as well go for it. If you've been convicted of a crime and you don't care how it looks, and of course, if you are a fraudster, you're probably not going to be as image conscious as a lot of people out there. What about international corruption cases linked to Trump allies? Another example involves Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras. A U.S. federal jury convicted Hernandez of conspiring to import cocaine into the United States and using firearms in drug trafficking operations. Now, with all of Trump's, hatred of drug traffickers, you would think that he would be more than thrilled that Hernandez got busted for this and sentenced. But no, the money was right. You know, I guess Trump got some money out of this. So, you know, he trafficked, I think it was like 400 tons of cocaine or something like that. Quite a lot of, you know, nose candy, nose sugar, booger sugar is is one term for it that's kind of fun. And prosecutors said that he helped run Honduras as a narco state and facilitated trafficking, again, of hundreds of tons of cocaine to the United States. His case, it really shows that corruption tied to political networks can involve extremely serious crimes beyond mere financial fraud. But that doesn't matter. You know, you can still get a pardon if you fork over like at least $1 million. And it's a it's a fair trade, perhaps. What about fraud scandals being common in Republican controlled states as well? Remember, the meme implies that corruption is concentrated only in these Democratic states like California or New York. In reality, many major corruption cases have occurred in Republican dominated states like Texas, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. And federal anti corruption prosecutions routinely target officials from both parties. Examples historically include Jack Abramoff, who had a lobbying corruption scandal as part of a Republican network. What about Tom DeLay and his campaign finance violations in Texas? What about the Alabama governor, Don Siegelman, who had a bribery case? There was the Mississippi welfare fraud scandal involving misuse of federal funds, numerous local corruption prosecutions across red states. In other words, corruption is not geographically partisan. What about fraud in the private sector and in conservative networks? Again, the meme frames fraud as something exposed mainly in the blue states, but many fraud cases are tied to conservative political networks that involve Ponzi schemes and investment frauds, campaign finance fraud, nonprofit and charity fraud. And for some examples of that, the Trump Foundation was shut down after findings of misuse of charitable funds. There was the Trump University settling fraud lawsuits for $25 million. Various conservative fundraising scams targeting elderly donors have been exposed. And these cases, they show that fraud often happens where money and power intersect, not in any particular state. And remember, Steve Bannon, he was busted for scamming his own supporters when he was having this Build the Wall campaign. He stole that money for personal use and somehow he avoided any sort of prison time. So, isn't that convenient? And the broader reality is that corruption is bipartisan and structural. The meme's core claim collapses when examined closely. So, you have a president who has criminal convictions and civil fraud findings. His company has been convicted of tax fraud. His top financial executive was he was busted and he served jail time. Multiple campaign officials were convicted of financial crimes. He pardoned or commuted sentences for fraudsters and corrupt officials. Meanwhile, corruption cases also exist among Democrats and independents. That is true. The pattern is simple. Fraud is not a blue state or a red state problem. It's a power and accountability problem. And of course, another obvious example of fraud or bribery, but it's also kind of fraud, is Trump receiving a $400 million jet from the country of Qatar. And yeah, that's a very obvious example of corruption. It is him receiving a gift from a foreign country so he can be buddy buddy with them. And the meme tries to frame corruption as something unique to democratic states, but real world evidence shows major fraud and corruption scandals involving Republican politicians, Trump associates, and individuals pardoned by Trump himself. If the goal is truly to prosecute powerful people who commit fraud against Americans, that standard would apply across the political spectrum, including the examples above. So you can't bark at me too loudly and claim, oh, you only cite Republican examples of fraud. Well, I also cited Rod Blagojevich, right? And of course, you could get into the examples of sex perversion too, and that's like a whole other episode. But guess what? There are shit tons of Republicans who would make that list as well. So, you conservatives out there, you probably don't want to, you know, go too far into that territory. It's a it's a very iffy topic if you want to be a partisan hack, because you don't want to see all of these Republican scandals when it comes to sex crime type of stuff. Anyway, that's it for this episode. I'm sure Republicans will hate it, but it's the truth. And you can handle the truth, I guess, if you are a Republican.